Hello, my name is Owen, and welcome to a quick review of A Little Life by Hanya, Yanagihara. What I want to do is give a brief overview of the book, about tell you the things that I liked and tell you the things that I didn't like, jumping straight into the overview. Very broadly, this is about a group of friends as they age in their friendship and their relationships from college age to adulthood. But there's a group of friends, but it really centers around one of the friends, Jude, who had a traumatic childhood and is kind of exploring how that affects him in his present day life and how that affects the relationships around him. That's the real focal point of this book. I don't want to say it's a controversial book, but it's a divisive book in a lot of ways. A lot of people that finish it either love it, it's one of their favorite books of all time. A lot of people read this book and they hate it, and it's a 1-star book, worst thing they ever read. Just to give you an overview of how I feel about the book, I did enjoy it. I think it's a really, really good book, but I'm not really on the extreme end of it. It's not one of my favorite books of all time. It's not like a 5-star book, in my opinion. There are things that I love, there are things that I like, and there are things that I didn't enjoy about this book, but it's interesting. It's one of the most interesting feelings I felt about a book because, and we'll go into more detail about this, but the things that I didn't like, and this is rare for criticism that I have about a book, I felt like everything that I didn't like about the book was very, very intentional by the author. Not that it was right or it was the right artistic decision, but I just felt like everything that I didn't prefer, it was a very intentional choice by the author, which makes me hate it less. And also, a lot of the good things that come out, or that I like about the book, come out of these things that I didn't like. So it's kind of like a strange relationship I have with this book where, let's just get into specifics, right? Some of the criticisms I have about this book, some of the things that I maybe not criticisms, maybe some of the things that I didn't like about this book. Firstly, I think the presenting of this book, maybe like how it's portrayed as what it's about, is a little bit misleading. And even what I told you at the beginning, it's about a group of friends from college age to adulthood. But then I said it's really about Jude. It's not really about this group of friends. It's really about Jude and Willem, and the other friends are just secondary characters. And even the first chunk of the book presents the story as if it's about this foursome of friends. Because we tackle an event from one person's perspective, and then we introduce to the one friend, and then we're going to go into his POV, and he's going to explain how he's met these people. And we do all 4 of the friends at the very early stage of the book, where it's like, this is my perspective, and obviously Jude's the focal point. It's like, well, this is my opinion about Jude. This is my opinion about Jude. This is my relationship with Jude. And because very obvious, like Jude is the focal point, the glue of this friend group, and we're going to see everybody's perspective as he interacts with their lives, how they interact with him, and all that stuff. But really, the 2 other friends, JB and Malcolm, they really fade away. Maybe not at the halfway point, maybe a little bit even earlier than that, but it's not these 4 perspectives throughout the story of their lives. It's really Willem and Jude that we stick with for the entire story. So I think saying it's these group of college friends as they age through adulthood, it's kind of misleading because it's really about Jude and Willem, right? That being said, while I really did enjoy these 4 perspectives, I thought it was very interesting stylized to switch between these 4 people. I think that Jude and Willem's relationship, especially when it gets like really into the depths of their relationship and their connection later on in the story, it's some of my favorite parts in the book. So I feel like I'm a little bit conflicted, whereas I would have liked to have read the book where all 4 of them were consistent POV characters following Jude and how they feel about Jude and all as his backstory comes to be revealed. But because I loved him and Willem's relationship so much, I'm glad we spent the most time on them. So it's like misleading, but the way I was misled, where it took me, I was happy with at the end. But just something you're aware of. It's the first chunk of the book, I just feel like is different stylistically, not in terms of the writing or the prose or anything like that, but just in terms of like how it's presented, like the promise of how the story is going to be presented, if that makes sense. Because we still occasionally get the POVs from Malcolm and JB, but they are far less prevalent. And there are other characters that kind of take preeminence into the importance of the story, and it's not necessarily these group of college friends. So that's something that I thought was strange about the book. Another thing as well, I thought it was a little long, and this will tie into my next complaint as well. My next complaint, again, it's not really a complaint. My next thing that kind of bothered me a little bit is like the main thing that people get bothered about, but the length. This is an 800-page book, and it's very dense, and this is a very dark story. It's a very difficult read. So making it 800 pages, it makes it feel like its length. And there were moments where I felt like it just dragged on a little bit. Not that it ever was bad, but let's just address the elephant in the room. This is a very dark subject matter. It covers topics like child abuse, sexual abuse, child sexual abuse. Jude's traumatic childhood is really like the inciting incident for this story. And it's structured in a way where it's like we're interacting with Jude as an adult. He's mysterious. He doesn't want to talk about his background. He's clearly traumatized at some time, and we're slowly piecemeal given his backstory. And it is horrific what has happened to this character. Extraordinarily tragic. And I think all of the scenes where we go into detail about what happened with him are very tastefully done. I don't think it's gratuitous in any way, but in some ways, it did kind of feel indulgent in that the sense, like so many bad things happened to Jude in the present and mostly in his backstory. And it's like not just one traumatic event that happened for a extended period of time. It's like 4 different chapters of, if one of them would have happened, it would have made sense for Jude to end up the way that he was. So just to have all of these stack on top of each other kind of just feels like, it just feels a little extra. It feels a little bit like the author was just doing it just to punch down on this fictional character. And at a certain point, it loses the impact because it starts to feel like it's about the traumatic things that was happening to him. It's about the abusers. It's about their specific actions rather than what trauma does to the character, which is what the book is about. And because the book is so long, those are the moments that stick out to me as like instant, you could cut these down. We don't need the 4th traumatic pedophilic abuser to come into the story, right? We could have stuck with just 2 of them. It is my opinion on the matter. And some people, the people who hate this book, they think it kind of glorifies it or it's overindulgent in this trauma. It's just like torture porn, as you would say. But I don't necessarily think I would go that far in my criticism. Like I said, it's all very tastefully done. It's not like darkly glorifying it anyway. It's not like it's not trying to be grimdark or edgy and just like saying traumatic things and dark things for the sake of that. It's definitely not the case. This book has a very clear stance on like how evil these people were that what they did to Jude and how disturbing it is. And you certainly feel disturbed when you're reading these chapters and you feel horrible for Jude. And in that sense, it's very well done. But it just happens so much that you can't help but feel like the author has gone not too far, but too long, if that makes sense. So that's the main thing. It's the length, but it's also the subject matter coupled with the length is like the other big thing that I had an issue with. But in terms of things that I liked, and again, I guess this goes back to there's 2 sides to every coin with the length, is the character work in this book is absolutely fantastic. It's set in New York with an unspecified time, but because we spend so much time with them, and in this way, the length is a good thing. The prose and the tone of the book, it allows you to settle in with these characters, if that makes sense. And because we spend so much time with them, because it's 800 pages, by the end of the book, you really feel like you've immersed yourself into the lives of Jude and Willem, into their friends, into their family. And in that way, like some of the emotional bits hit a little bit harder. And I'm not someone, reading this book at least, where I got super emotional, because obviously Jude is such a tragic character. But some of the parts where I got most emotional was the relationship between him and Willem, where it got even beautiful, where it got even sweet, where they had the tender moments. That's the stuff that really like made me kind of emotional, and that was built on the backs of them being in college together, them growing up as adults together, and us spending all these like vignettes of their life together. By the time you get to the 600, 700 page mark, you have lived with these characters. And in some ways too, the darkness, the traumatic, like it allows you to attach yourselves more tightly to these characters. So that's like, it's very strange that every criticism I have in a lot of ways is like counterbalanced by like what it does to me at different parts of the book. Because you could say that maybe you went too hard on or too long on the traumatic parts, but then again, like I do feel like I grasped so tightly to Jude, and I felt so bad for him, and I cared for him so deeply that a lot of the story beats like hit harder, I guess, at the end of the story. So it's conflicting. It's like, where do you draw the line? And I think that's why overall how I feel about this book, like it's definitively a piece of art. And I obviously, like, you write any kind of book, it's a piece of art, it's a piece of creative work. But you know what I mean, right? It's a piece of art. And that's what I meant at the very beginning, too. The author is very intentional about these things. So maybe we think that she went too long in the traumatic bits, but maybe she thought that was the right amount in order for you to fully understand the gravity of Jude's backstory, allow you to fully immerse yourself in these story and these characters, and in the pain that not only Jude feels from his childhood, but also the characters when they learn about his childhood trauma. There's something to be said that there's a lot of like desensitizing to this kind of stuff in media. So maybe the author thought that we're desensitized, so one isn't enough. One instance isn't enough. It doesn't justify Jude lashing out. It doesn't justify his weak moments if it's just one thing, which obviously is not true in the real world sense, but maybe in the media sense, it is. So we needed to really hammer home the point of so many tragic things so you as the reader can appreciate, I don't know if appreciate's the right word, but grasp the gravity of the situation. Maybe that's the angle we're going for, and maybe we just disagree slightly, me as in me and the author, on how long it needs to be effective. That's entirely the case. But the characters are so well done, really immersed in the story, and you kind of insert yourself into this group of people. And it's some of the most immersive reading that I've read in a long time, where you open the book and you're instantly transported into that headspace, right? And this is the type of book, partly because of the subject matter, partly because of the writing and the tone and the immersiveness, that sits with you on a weight. It sits on your shoulders as you're reading it, which could be a good thing for people and could be a bad thing for people. I read this book in a very short period of time. I read it over like I think it was 3 or 4 days. It was basically over a weekend. And I don't know if I would recommend reading it that fast, but I'm almost glad I did because of how heavy it sit with me when I wasn't reading it, right? You start to think about Jude and how he lives his everyday life and the things that happened to him in the past. And I just found myself in my day-to-day when I was not reading, just thinking about these characters as if they were people that I actually knew. It's like, oh, I feel so bad for Jude. Like, and that's like a strange relationship that I've not had with a book in a long time, but maybe ever. The way it just sat with me when I wasn't reading it, because then you open back the book and you're back in the world. These are characters that do sit with you, and I think that's a very strong. Like, you got to give strong kudos, I guess, to the author for being able to do that. It's a very hard thing to have characters sit with you, and even just have you remember them after finishing the book, much less sit with you outside of reading the book while you're reading it. The book kind of encompassed my life for that weekend, which was a very strange experience for me. But the negative side to that is because it's such a dark subject matter, and I don't know, like, it could be triggering to people if you have experience of any of this kind of trauma in your past. I could definitely see that. But not everybody wants to be put into a darker headspace when reading for entertainment. And it's easy to say, like, oh, it's a dark book. Like, I want to express, like, it is, like, it sits with you and it's dark, which I feel like is another level, right? And I don't always tell people to avoid books just because they're dark, but, like, I could very well see the possibilities, like, if you don't want something like that sitting with you, if you can't separate it that easily and it would make you, like, uncomfortable, this book is very effective at making you uncomfortable. So if you, like, it's just something to be warned about, I guess. And then I guess a more lighter criticism, I would say, would be this book covers a very large period of time. Like I said, it starts from their college and it ends when these characters are like in their 50s and their 60s. And then obviously there's flashbacks from Jude from when he was a kid, when he was like under 10, teen years, like tween years. It covers a very long period of time, but the main period is college to like late adulthood. The only issue I had with this, and some of the time jumps I found were confusing because you'd be switching POVs and then they would, in the middle of their story, it's kind of like train of thought thinking where it's like, well, this reminds me of this, which was 2 years ago when you were in this apartment, but now the character's in this apartment and they just moved into this apartment. So there's some like timeline stuff that I found a little disorienting, but it is train of thought. So that's not really what my criticism is. I think that was interesting the way that was done. It was very like remembering a story, how a person gets sidetracked and lost in the story. It had some of that. The only thing I had a criticism about was, even though we're spending 40 years with these characters, the conversations that they have, the way that they speak, the way that they act isn't entirely different from 20s to late 50s. I feel like a lot of the conversations that are had in the later parts of the book kind of sound exactly the same as the conversations in terms of style as when they were 20. So kind of like the growing up with the characters into adulthood and maturing as adults didn't really happen for me in terms of the difference in writing. Now, I think and this wasn't a stylistic choice, because it's not like, oh, Jude was stunted by his trauma. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about every single character, and that includes like Harold and his wife and Willem and the people they interact with, their secondary friends. They all act the same, and you could take a scene in the latter half of the book where Jude's in his 50s, and you could just say, I was 21 when this happened, and it would have fit in, which I think is kind of a missed opportunity. And it would have been much, much harder to pull off, I think, having this large period of time and have these characters act in a realistic way for their ages. And I guess you could say that maybe we're all young at heart, right? So they're thinking the same way. We're so deep into their emotional psyche that we can't tell the difference. I don't think so. I think they all kind of acted the same throughout it. But because the characters were so good, because I was so immersed, it didn't detract a lot. It's just something that I noticed and I wanted to point out. And then finally, the other big thing I wanted to talk about is the ending. The ending, I could see, and I haven't read a lot about people's reaction to the ending, but this is not, let me just emphasize again, this is not a happy book, guys. And a lot of this book is like watching a car crash in slow motion for a lot of reasons, actually, but it is a tragedy through and through. And I think the tone that the author takes, or I guess the message that is delivered at the very ending, is kind of confusing, because a lot of what happens at the ending is presented as being inevitable, which might be true for the characters, but I think that it's a dangerous message to be presented to the people. And it was presented as more like, this is the lesson of the book. Things like this are inevitable. Instead of being like, this was inevitability for this character, because presenting it as a wider message. And this book deals heavily with stuff like self-harm, suicide, and stuff like that. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. That kind of rubbed me the wrong way as well. I think not necessarily the events that happened, but how it was presented leading up to and after the fact. It just didn't sit quite right with me. I don't think it was done, again, super mistastefully, but there was something slightly off about it, and I just wanted to make note of that. But overall, like I said, absolutely a piece of art, and I don't regret reading this. I think it was a fantastic read, but I don't know. I think I just thought the most interesting part of this review for me, just if I'm rating my own video, was how like my contradictions also led to things that I loved about the book. I think how Yanagihara writes about love in this story is very, very beautiful. I think the building of the romantic relationship is some of the best, like yeah, obviously, and they're so great. It's just, it's really, really beautiful stuff, and I loved the love story in this book. I love a good romance. What can I say? And this is it's just beautifully done, and it was definitely, I think, hands down, the romance in this book was my favorite part of the book. It was just so beautiful. But other than that, I can see why it's controversial. I can see why some people love it. I can see why some people hate it. And overall, it's just an interesting book, and I encourage you, if you're up for it, to check it out. And be sure to like and subscribe if you like the video and you want to see more like it in the future. More books like this I would take as a recommendation as well. This kind of like literary fiction, maybe not necessarily so much on the dark side, but just like a group of people in the modern day or unspecified time day, hanging out, living life. I don't know. It's an interesting topic. I'm sure there's infinite number of books about it. But as always, thanks for sticking around.